This is a sound you hear every day. Beep, beep, beep. Over 5 billion times a day, worldwide. The invention that underpins all modern commerce was sold by its creator for $15,000. This wasn't foolishness. It was an act of desperation. In the 1950s, no one believed that a technology a quarter century ahead of its time could even work. How did the most inconspicuous idea in history become one of the most influential, while its creator received almost nothing for it? This raises the first impossible question. How did two graduate students in 1949 manage to develop a technology requiring lasers and computers when neither was readily available? And second, why did their initial, most elegant and logical bullseye code idea fail spectacularly, giving way to the simple lines we know today? This isn't just a story, it's an investigation. By the end of this film, you'll gain 6 keys to understanding the invisible system governing every purchase you make. Together, we'll crack the code that changed the world. We'll start with chaos. In just 2 minutes, you'll find yourself at the epicenter of post-war supermarkets, the problem that ignited this incredible technological race. In an era of atomic energy and jet engines, the simplest task, counting goods quickly, was almost impossible. It didn't start with a brilliant plan, but with a chance complaint. In 1948, graduate student Bernard Silver overheard a conversation between the dean and the director of a local food fair supermarket chain. The director was practically shouting about losses due to cashier errors and inventory chaos. But this wasn't just one manager's complaint. It was a symptom of a widespread ailment affecting the entire American economy. Hundreds of new supermarkets opened each year, but their growth hit an invisible ceiling, the speed of a cashier's hands. Silver realized that whoever solved this problem would hold the key to the future of commerce. He also knew it wasn't a task for him alone. He approached his friend, the more gifted engineer, Norman Woodland. This conversation would mark the beginning of a partnership that would change the game for the entire planet. So, how exactly did this manual chaos work? Why was the system doomed? There were snaking queues, cashiers manually typing each price into a mechanical register, and price tags that constantly peeled off. At night, there was exhausting inventory counting with a pencil and notepad. But it wasn't about human laziness. It was a technological dead end. IBM, a giant in the industry, proposed a solution using punch cards, but it was absurd. No one was going to attach a cardboard card to every can of peas. Woodland concluded that the system didn't need improvement, it needed replacement. He quit his teaching job and moved to Miami to live with his grandfather, immersing himself completely in the problem. This leap into the unknown, away from the hustle, would prove decisive for the entire world. Why hadn't any of the corporate giants like General Electric or RCA solved this billion-dollar problem? There had been attempts, such as experiments with ultraviolet inks. A code invisible to the eye wouldn't spoil packaging, and a solution seemed close. But all these ideas faced the same adversary, the technological limitations of the 1950s. UV lamps were expensive and bulky. One lamp cost over $120, a cashier's weekly wage. The inks were unstable. The problem wasn't the code itself, it was the eyes that were supposed to read it. Anyone tackling this challenge had to invent not just a code, but an entire system, code plus reader, decades ahead of its time. Woodland understood this, and he sought the key to the solution not in the future, but in the past, in a technology familiar to every Boy Scout. How can a complete creative block lead to a brilliant breakthrough? What happens in an inventor's mind at such a moment? In Miami, Norman Woodland hit a wall. He sifted through dozens of options, complex patterns, perforations, markers. Everything was impractical. He'd left his job, but there was no solution. Yet, this period of inaction wasn't a failure, but an incubation. It was like a seed lying dormant in the ground during winter, gathering strength for a breakthrough. His mind continued to work in the background. Then, sitting on the beach, he stopped thinking about the problem. He simply watched the waves and idly drew with his fingers in the sand. It was at this precise moment that the answer the entire industry was searching for literally appeared at his fingertips. He drew dots and dashes, Morse code, a technology from the 1830s he'd learned as a Boy Scout. But how could a telegraph help a supermarket? The breakthrough wasn't in the code itself, but in a simple question he asked himself while tracing his fingers through the wet sand. What if I extend these dots and dashes downwards? In that moment, a dot became a thin line, and a dash became a thick one. This was the birth of the barcode. He instantly realized that a combination of these lines could represent any digit. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, but turning it into a working system was an entirely different, almost impossible task. How do these black and white stripes store information? The principle is elementary. A thin line is a conditional 0. A thick one is a 1. A combination of 4 such stripes can encode any digit from 0 to 9. But patent documents conceal the harsh truth about the reality of the 1950s. For initial tests, Woodland built a prototype using a 500-watt incandescent lamp from a film projector and an oscilloscope to read reflected light. It worked in the lab, but the cost of this setup exceeded a cashier's annual salary. The idea existed, but the world wasn't technologically ready for it. However, before hitting this wall, Woodland devised another detail he believed would solve all problems. Imagine you're an inventor. How would you arrange these lines to make them as easy as possible for a cashier to scan without having to rotate the item? The obvious answer is in a straight line, as we're accustomed to today. But Woodland's first patented solution was entirely different. He arranged the lines into concentric circles, creating a bullseye resembling a dartboard. His logic was flawless. A circular code could be scanned from any angle. This solved 2 main cashier problems: speed and item orientation. It seemed like a perfect, ideal solution. This ingenious idea was so good, it almost buried the entire invention forever. In 1952, Woodland and Silver received U.S. patent number 2,612,994. So why didn't the world see barcodes on products in the 1950s or 1960s? They offered their system to IBM. The answer was polite but unequivocal, interesting but impractical. There was no technology for mass, inexpensive scanning. Reality hit hard. They sold the patent to Philco for just $15,000. It was an act of desperation because there were no investors for this fantasy. An invention 20 years ahead of its time was shelved. But while the patent gathered dust in the archives, a technology was being born in secret labs that would give it a second life, a beam of light capable of reading the invisible. So why did the perfect solution, the circular code that could be scanned from any side, lose out to simple lines? Woodland's logic was impeccable. The cashier wouldn't need to rotate the item. The scanner would catch the code from any angle. It was the pinnacle of engineering elegance. But archival reports from the 1970s reveal a fatal flaw. It wasn't in the electronics, but in the printing ink. With the imperfect equipment of the time, ink, when applied to absorbent cardboard, would slightly bleed. Imagine a drop of water spreading on a napkin. For a linear code, this wasn't critical. The smudging occurred along the lines. But in a circular code, even minimal bleeding led to disaster. Neighboring rings merged into an unreadable blob. The simple physics of ink destroyed a brilliant idea. But printing was only the first problem. The second came from the very technology meant to fix everything. How did a technology that didn't exist at the time of the code's invention dictate its form 20 years later? In the late 1960s, the laser scanner emerged, cheap, compact, and reliable. It was the missing piece, but it proved to be a Trojan horse for the bullseye code. The first commercial helium neon scanners were designed to be as simple as possible. Their optics consisted of a single rotating mirror that traced a single straight line of red light across an item. Scanning a complex circular structure would have required a much more expensive system capable of seeing the entire pattern. This made it unprofitable. The technology that was supposed to bring the invention to life dictated its own harsh, linear terms. It made its choice. Now, the decision lay with the people managing a multi-billion-dollar industry. Who made the decision that defined the appearance of price tags on the planet for the next 50 years, and how? In the early 1970s, leaders of the largest U.S. supermarket chains formed a committee. Their task, to choose a single standard to avoid chaos. On paper, it looked like a well-considered decision. In reality, it was an arena for a battle of giants. IBM, RCA, and Singer lobbied for their own code formats. Billions of dollars in patent royalties and control over a market of more than 100,000 supermarkets in the U.S. alone were at stake. This was a moment of truth. Had they failed to agree, the industry would have plunged into a war of incompatible systems, as happened with videocassettes, and the main battle unfolded between two irreconcilable technological titans. What would our world look like if the linear code hadn't won that battle? Dozens of options were presented to the committee. Some were refined versions of RCA's bullseye, others resembled complex patterns or color codes. But it wasn't about design. The company whose standard was adopted would gain everything: a monopoly on scanners, licensing fees, and technological superiority for decades. It was a zero-sum game. Two titans with two different philosophies stepped onto the stage: RCA, promoting the elegant but finicky bullseye, and IBM, bidding on the simple and reliable linear code. Their confrontation would determine the future of global commerce. Two corporations, two standards. But only one could win. Why was IBM, the eventual winner, initially the primary opponent of the barcode idea itself? For decades, the corporation had built an empire on complex, expensive systems. Its standard product, the punch card, stored 80 bytes of data and required a reader the size of a cabinet. The barcode seemed to them a primitive, cheap, and unreliable technology. It threatened their business model. But archives show that pressure from their main clients, retail giants, became unbearable. They demanded a solution. If IBM didn't provide one, they would turn to RCA, which was already actively promoting its bullseye code. IBM was forced into the game not out of belief in the technology, but out of fear of losing market share. They entered the race with one condition: not to support another standard, but to create their own, superior one. Their main trump card was the man who knew more about barcodes than anyone else on the planet. What was the key difference between the two giants' codes? RCA presented its refined bullseye. It was elegant and could be scanned from any angle. It was a bulb, technology of the future, designed for cashier convenience. But then IBM entered the scene with its version, Woodland's perfected linear code. It was less convenient, requiring item orientation. However, IBM engineers proved through hundreds of tests that it was far more resistant to printing errors and could be read even with partial damage. The committee's choice was like deciding between elegant dress shoes for a perfect ballroom floor and sturdy work boots for any weather. It was a dilemma: cashier convenience versus overall system reliability. In your life, do you more often choose convenience or reliability? To tip the scales in its favor, IBM used a secret weapon. What role did the very man who 25 years earlier drew the first code in the sand, Norman Woodland, play in this battle? By the early 1970s, Norman Woodland had been an engineer at IBM for many years. He found himself at the heart of the conflict he himself had originated. It was a moment of cruel irony. Woodland, the father of the circular code, was compelled to present to the committee. Based on IBM's test data, he convincingly argued that his company's linear code was superior to his own initial invention, which RCA was now promoting. The authority and technical arguments of the founding father became the decisive factor. It was a triumph of engineering pragmatism over the romance of the first idea. The decision was made, but that was only half the journey. The next step was to convince thousands of stores that this wasn't just an expensive toy. On April 3, 1973, IBM's UPC standard was officially chosen. So why did nothing change in stores the next day? It seemed that all manufacturers would immediately start printing codes, and supermarkets would acquire scanners. This appeared to be the inevitable conclusion of the story. But reality was different. Most store owners and manufacturers adopted a wait-and-see approach. No one wanted to be first and spend vast sums on an unproven system without being sure it would pay off. The numbers were dismal. By 1980, 7 years later, only 8,000 stores in the U.S., less than 1%, were using barcodes. The system existed, the standard existed, but they were unwanted. A trailblazer was needed, someone willing to risk everything. And that moment arrived on June 26, 1974, in the small town of Troy, Ohio, where a single pack of chewing gum was about to make history. How did an ordinary pack of Wrigley's Juicy Fruit gum, purchased on June 26, 1974, become a key exhibit at the National Museum of American History? The scene at the Marsh supermarket in Ohio was staged as the culmination of a 25-year saga, engineers, breathless press, and cashier Sharon Buchanan ready to make history. The reputation of corporations and the fate of an invention hung in the balance, but reality proved more prosaic. The choice of the gum pack was accidental. Sharon Buchanan passed it over the red beam of a helium neon laser. That familiar electronic beep sounded. The price of 67 cents appeared on the screen. The technology worked flawlessly. A hush fell over the room, followed by applause from the engineers. It seemed a revolution would begin tomorrow. Instead of a flurry of adoptions, there was almost complete silence. And this explains why the next stage in barcode history is called the Lost 6 Years. How did a technology that proved its effectiveness end up unwanted? If the system worked, why weren't stores lining up for it? The first obvious explanation is the classic chicken and egg problem. Retailers wouldn't buy expensive scanners until most products were barcoded, and manufacturers wouldn't spend money printing codes until stores had scanners. This appears to be a clear market impasse. But the numbers dismantle this picture. By 1980, 6 years later, only 8,000 stores in the U.S., less than 1%, were using barcodes. This wasn't an impasse, it was a total failure. The industry wasn't just hesitant, it actively resisted. Trade journals wrote about the barcode as an expensive toy. The true reasons for this resistance weren't economic. Have you ever resisted an innovation that later became the norm? What made people fear simple black stripes? This utilitarian accounting tool spawned a wave of rumors and even conspiracy theories about the mark of the beast. Shoppers feared smart machines would cheat them, and cashiers worried their jobs would be automated. But these were just the visible parts of the iceberg. The main opponents weren't the cashiers, but their bosses. Investing in scanning equipment for a single store cost between $100,000 and $200,000. In 1975, that was the equivalent of over $500,000 today. That money could have opened a new store. This was a cold calculation. The battle for the barcode was fought not at the checkout counters, but in the boardrooms. It was an exhausting war of persuasion, and the turning point didn't come through coaxing. Why did a dead technology, ignored for almost a decade, suddenly become mandatory? The few pioneering stores that adopted the system began to reap hidden benefits, accurate inventory tracking, and invaluable sales data. It seemed this would be a slow, evolutionary process. But then the titans emerged. Chains like Kmart and Walmart saw the barcode not as an optimization tool, but as a weapon to destroy competitors. They issued an ultimatum, demanding that all their suppliers apply barcodes to every product. This wasn't a domino effect, it was a phased transition, like water instantly turning into ice. For thousands of small manufacturers, Walmart's ultimatum meant a choice between printing barcodes and exiting the market. The question was no longer implement or not, but implement or die. This ultimatum transformed stores into nerve centers of the new system, but the true power of the code was about to be revealed far beyond their walls. How did a technology designed to speed up checkout lines become the foundation of the entire global economy? First, the code took an invisible step beyond the cash register, into warehouses and assembly lines. The just-in-time system, where parts arrive at a Ford or Toyota conveyor belt precisely when needed, became possible only through scanning. This radically reduced inventory and accelerated production. But the reality proved even more expansive. Without the barcode, neither Amazon's giant warehouses, nor FedEx's express delivery, nor Maersk's global shipping would be possible. Every beep on a container in a Singapore port or on a package in a sorting center is part of a unified system that functions as the planet's nervous system. The barcode became a universal passport for any physical object, from your luggage at the airport to bags of donor blood in a hospital. But what is the scale of this daily global conversation? What happens more frequently in the world than Google searches or social media likes? Barcode scanning. Over 5 billion times every single day. In the time it takes you to drink your morning coffee, there are more scanner beeps worldwide than beats of your heart. But these aren't 5 billion isolated events. Each scan triggers a chain reaction. A beep on a milk carton in your store updates the warehouse database in real time, sends an order to the supplier, and influences the production plan at a factory hundreds of miles away. This isn't just an accounting system, it's the global nervous system of the economy, reacting instantly to demand and reallocating resources. A one-day halt would lead to collapse. But what did the creators of this invisible empire receive? How could Norman Woodland sell the patent for a technology underpinning a trillion-dollar industry for just $15,000? He lived to be 91, witnessed the triumph of his invention, and received the U.S. National Medal of Technology from the President. This might seem like fair recognition, but the facts paint a different picture. $15,000 in 1952 versus 5 billion daily scans today. That amount today wouldn't even buy a basic car. This is a story that genius and commercial success are entirely different things. For Woodland, the main prize wasn't wealth, but legacy. That fleeting gesture, the simple movement of his fingers on the Miami beach sand, blossomed through decades to become the invisible architecture of our world. It was a victory of an idea over money. But is this idea eternal? In our age of QR codes and smart RFID tags, why hasn't this dinosaur from the 70s gone extinct? A QR code stores more data. An RFID tag doesn't require line of sight. It seems the barcode is a floppy disk in an era of cloud storage. But in practice, the opposite is true. The classic barcode remains the cheapest and most reliable standard in the world. Its infrastructure, billions of scanners and trillions of printed codes, is colossal. Replacing it would be more expensive than sending a mission to Mars. The barcode isn't a floppy disk, it's a nail. Yes, screws and anchors have emerged, but for 90% of basic tasks, a nail remains the simplest solution. The barcode's genius lies in its stupidity. It doesn't store the price, only a unique number. All information resides in a database. This ultimate simplicity has made it eternal. Now looking back, let's gather the 6 keys to this incredible story. The story we've just told isn't merely an invention story. It's the anatomy of a revolution. It illustrates how an idea goes through 6 essential stages to transform from a drawing in the sand into a global infrastructure. First, an intractable problem, the chaos in supermarkets. Second, a brilliant insight that turned Morse code into a scannable code. Third, brutal evolution, where practical lines triumphed over the elegant bullseye. Fourth, a corporate war that forged a unified standard. Fifth, the tentative first beep and a decade of silent resistance. And sixth, the triumph that transformed the code into the planet's nervous system. Skip any of these stages, and the revolution wouldn't have happened. Thus, a drawing in the sand became the language the world speaks. And now that the entire journey has been covered, we can finally answer the 2 main mysteries posed at the very beginning. At the very beginning, we posed 2 questions that seemed insoluble. It's time to provide direct answers. How did Woodland and Silver manage to create a technology requiring lasers and computers 25 years before their existence? The answer: they invented not a device, but a pure informational concept. Their breakthrough was in coding theory, not electronics. This idea was like a seed that waited a quarter century for its spring rain, the advent of lasers, to sprout. And the second question: why did their first, most logical bullseye idea lose? The answer: harsh pragmatism triumphed over elegance. On the imperfect printing presses of the time, ink would slightly bleed, causing the circles to merge into an unreadable smudge. Simple lines were far more resistant to defects. Reliability proved more important than grace. The barcode story teaches us that even the most brilliant idea must be willing to wait and adapt to imperfect reality to succeed. So what is the true legacy of Woodland and Silver? The answer isn't in the black stripes we see every day. The main protagonist of this story, its hidden engine, isn't the technology itself. It's the standard. Without the single UPC standard, adopted after the corporate war, the world would have had dozens of incompatible systems, and no revolution would have occurred. It was agreement and unification that transformed a good idea into a global force. A standard is like the threading on a nut and bolt. On their own, they're useless. But when their threads match, they can fasten anything. The UPC standard became the universal threading for global commerce. The barcode's legacy is proof that for a brilliant idea to change the world, it needs 3 things: the technology to implement it, a standard to propagate it, and time for its adoption. Are there examples in your own life where a simple agreement on rules changed everything? Now that you know the entire story, from the beach to a global empire, we want to ask you the main question. What, in your opinion, was decisive in the incredible success of the barcode? Write just one word in the comments. Idea, if you believe everything was decided by Woodland's brilliant conceptual breakthrough, so perfect it could wait 25 years. Or time, if you think the idea was nothing without the advent of lasers and computers that made it viable. Idea or time, which is primary for a true revolution? There's no right answer, but your choice will reveal how you view the history of innovation. We are incredibly interested in what you think. Let's start the discussion.